When President Trump returned to office and unleashed the country's highest tariffs in nearly a century, many expected Europe to retaliate. A transatlantic trade war would have fed inflation, disrupted supply chains, and weakened already fragile growth. That restraint prevented a downward global spiral.
Donald Trump just got hit with something he never expected, and the panic inside the White House is absolutely real right now. A federal judge didn't just block one of Trump's policies. They didn't just issue some routine legal order that gets appealed and forgotten. What happened is far more significant and far more dangerous for Trump's entire presidency. The courts just demonstrated they still have teeth. They still have authority. And Trump's assumption that he could bulldoze through constitutional limits using emergency declarations just got shattered in the most public and humiliating way possible. Before we break down exactly what happened and why this matters so much, make sure you subscribe John Brown's show. We're giving you the real analysis without corporate spin. Here's the situation. Trump has been operating under a very specific theory of presidential power since taking office. That theory goes something like this. During emergencies, the president essentially becomes uncheckable. Congress can't restrain him because emergencies require immediate action, and legislative process takes too long. Courts can't stop him because he's the unitary executive with complete authority over the executive branch. And the definition of emergency is basically whatever Trump says it is at any given moment. This isn't speculation about Trump's worldview. His lawyers have argued this explicitly in court filings. His administration has acted on these principles repeatedly. Every time Trump faces opposition to something he wants to do, he just declares an emergency and claims that emergency declaration gives him sweeping authority to bypass normal constitutional processes. Want to impose tariffs that Congress would never approve? Declare an economic emergency. Want to deploy military forces in ways that violate federal law? Declare a security emergency. Want to restructure the entire federal workforce? Emergency powers. The problem with this approach is it completely undermines the entire system of checks and balances that supposedly prevents any one branch of government from accumulating too much power. If presidents can just declare emergencies whenever they want and then claim unlimited authority during those emergencies, Congress becomes irrelevant and courts become powerless. The presidency transforms from one branch among three into an elected dictatorship that operates without meaningful restraint. And for the first few weeks of Trump's term, this strategy was actually working pretty well for him. He'd declare emergencies, invoke various statutory authorities, implement aggressive policies, and by the time anyone could challenge him in court, the damage was already done. Even when judges eventually ruled against him, Trump would just move on to the next crisis while his lawyers appealed the unfavorable rulings. It created this pattern where Trump always stayed one step ahead of judicial oversight. But something just changed that pattern in a fundamental way. A federal judge looked at Trump's latest emergency declaration and essentially said this entire framework is unconstitutional, not just this specific policy, not just this particular use of emergency authority. The whole concept of presidents declaring emergencies and then claiming those declarations exempt them from normal legal constraints. The case involved Trump's attempt to federalize National Guard units and deploy them for domestic law enforcement purposes. Trump claimed he needed to activate the Insurrection Act because local authorities couldn't maintain order during protests. According to Trump's legal theory, once he invokes the Insurrection Act, his authority becomes essentially unlimited. He can deploy military forces however he wants. Courts can't second-guess his judgment about whether an insurrection actually exists. Nobody can check his actions because they're taken pursuant to emergency powers. The judge rejected that argument completely, and the reasoning matters enormously because it establishes a principle that extends far beyond this one case. The judge said emergency statutes don't create zones of unreviewable presidential authority. They're still laws passed by Congress with specific limitations and requirements. Presidents have to follow those limitations even during emergencies. Courts retain their authority to review whether presidents are actually complying with statutory requirements or just using emergency language to grab power. Congress never authorized. This might sound like boring legal technicalities, but it's actually revolutionary in the current political context. Because what the judge is saying is that Trump can't just magic his way out of constitutional constraints by shouting the word emergency. He still has to follow the law. He still has to stay within the boundaries Congress established. And courts will enforce those boundaries even when Trump claims national security or public safety requires unlimited executive action. If the immediate practical effect was that Trump's National Guard federalization got blocked. He can't deploy military units the way he wanted to. But the broader implication is far more significant. Every other emergency declaration Trump has issued or plans to issue now becomes vulnerable to the same analysis. His tariff emergency, his immigration emergency, his claims about needing emergency powers to restructure the federal government, all of it can now be challenged on the grounds that emergency statutes have limits, and courts can enforce those limits. Trump's reaction to this ruling tells you everything about how seriously he takes the threat. His social media went into overdrive, attacking the judge personally, calling them an activist, questioning their legitimacy, demanding they be investigated. The White House issued statements claiming the ruling creates immediate national security dangers. Republican allies started talking about impeaching the judge or stripping the court's jurisdiction. This isn't how you respond to routine legal setbacks. This is panic over a ruling that threatens your entire governing strategy. Because here's what Trump understands, even if his supporters don't. His whole presidency depends on courts deferring to his emergency claims. If judges start actually scrutinizing whether genuine emergencies exist and whether Trump's actions stay within statutory bounds, most of what he's doing falls apart. The tariffs he imposed by declaring economic emergencies probably exceed his authority under the relevant statutes. The immigration enforcement actions he's taking using emergency declarations likely violate specific limitations Congress built into those laws. The personnel decisions he's making by invoking crisis authority probably contradict civil service protections. None of this stuff would survive serious judicial review if courts actually applied normal legal standards. Trump's been getting away with it only because courts have been reluctant to second-guess presidential emergency determinations. They've assumed that when a president says an emergency exists, courts should defer to that judgment. But this ruling shows that assumption is starting to break down. At least some judges are willing to look behind the emergency label and ask whether what Trump's doing actually matches what the law allows. The timing of this ruling makes it even more devastating for Trump. He's only been in office a few weeks. His entire second-term agenda depends on using emergency powers to accomplish things Congress would never authorize. Trade policy through emergency tariffs, immigration enforcement through emergency deployments, government restructuring through emergency personnel actions. Everything runs through the emergency powers pipeline. If that pipeline gets shut down by courts willing to actually review his emergency claims, Trump loses his primary tool for implementing his agenda. He'd have to go through Congress for everything, negotiate with senators who don't always agree with him, compromise with representatives who have their own priorities, follow normal legislative processes that take months or years. That's not how Trump operates. He wants to act unilaterally through executive power, and emergency declarations are how he justifies that unilateral action. So when a court says emergency declarations don't exempt you from legal limits, that's an existential threat to Trump's presidency, not just an inconvenient legal obstacle to work around, an actual structural barrier to his entire approach to governing. No wonder he's terrified. No wonder the White House is in full crisis mode, trying to delegitimize this ruling before it spreads to other courts. And it is spreading. Other federal judges are starting to cite this ruling in their own decisions. When Trump's lawyers show up claiming emergency powers justify some aggressive action, judges are responding with skepticism instead of deference. They're asking for evidence that genuine emergencies exist. They're examining whether Trump's proposed actions actually fit within the statutory authorities he's invoking. They're granting temporary restraining orders that block Trump's policies while courts evaluate their legality. This represents a fundamental shift in how the judicial branch is approaching Trump's presidency. During his first term, courts often gave him the benefit of the doubt on emergency claims. They'd express concerns but ultimately defer to presidential judgment about national security and crisis response. Now, courts are treating Trump's emergency declarations as legal claims that require proof rather than assertions that deserve automatic acceptance. The change probably reflects lessons learned from Trump's first term. Judges watched him abuse emergency authorities repeatedly, declare crises that didn't actually exist to justify policies he couldn't get through normal processes, invoke statutory powers far beyond what Congress intended when writing those laws, and courts are apparently deciding they're not going to enable that pattern during his second term. But there's also a deeper constitutional question at stake here that goes beyond Trump specifically. Do we want a system where presidents can essentially govern by emergency declaration, where normal checks and balances get suspended whenever the president decides circumstances require urgent action, where congressional authority and judicial review become optional depending on whether the president claims an emergency exists? That's the system Trump is trying to create, and it's fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy, because once you establish that presidents have unlimited authority during declared emergencies, and presidents get to define what counts as an emergency, you've effectively eliminated constraints on presidential power. Every president would just declare more emergencies to accomplish more policy goals without dealing with Congress or courts. This ruling pushes back against that trajectory. It says emergencies don't suspend the Constitution. Statutory authorities still have limits even when invoked during crises. Courts retain their obligation to ensure presidents follow the law, regardless of what national security justifications get offered. That's a crucial principle to establish if we want to maintain any meaningful separation of powers. Of course, Trump and his allies are attacking the ruling as judicial activism. They're claiming judges are substituting their judgment for the president's on matters of national security. They're arguing courts lack the expertise to evaluate emergency situations and should defer to executive branch determinations. It's the standard playbook for presidents who don't like being told they can't do something. But the argument fails on its own terms, because the judge didn't substitute their judgment about whether an emergency exists. They evaluated whether Trump's actions complied with the statutory requirements Congress established for emergency situations. That's exactly what courts are supposed to do: review executive actions against legal standards to ensure presidents stay within their authority. It's not activism to enforce statutory limits. It's basic judicial responsibility. The real activism would be courts refusing to review presidential actions just because they're labeled as emergency responses. That would mean abandoning judicial review entirely for huge categories of executive decisions, letting presidents operate without any meaningful oversight whenever they claim urgent circumstances. That's not respecting executive authority. That's abdicating judicial duty, and the consequences of that abdication would be catastrophic. We've seen throughout history what happens when executives claim emergency powers without meaningful checks. Those emergencies become permanent. Those temporary authorities become permanent expansions of executive power. What starts as crisis response turns into normal governance conducted through emergency declarations that never get lifted. Trump's already showing this pattern. His emergency declarations don't end when the supposed crises resolve. They just keep getting renewed indefinitely because there's always some new justification for maintaining emergency authorities. If courts don't intervene to force Trump to actually demonstrate genuine emergencies exist and his actions stay within statutory bounds, we'll end up with a permanent state of emergency that becomes the new normal for how presidents govern. So this ruling matters enormously, regardless of how you feel about Trump's specific policies. It's about whether constitutional limits on presidential power mean anything or just become suggestions that presidents ignore whenever convenient. Whether courts will enforce the law against presidents or just rubber stamp whatever executives want to do. Whether we maintain separation of powers or drift toward an imperial presidency that operates above legal constraints. Trump understands these stakes even if he pretends not to. That's why he's responding with such fury to a ruling that on its face just blocks one policy in one case. Because he knows if this principle takes hold across the judiciary, his entire governing strategy collapses. He can't rule by emergency declaration if courts are going to scrutinize those declarations and enforce statutory limits. He'd have to govern like a normal president, working through Congress, following established processes, accepting that there are things he simply can't do unilaterally. That's unacceptable to Trump. His entire political identity is built around being the strongman who acts decisively without restraint, who cuts through bureaucratic processes and legal obstacles to get things done, who doesn't let courts or Congress slow him down. Accepting judicial limits on his emergency powers would mean accepting that he's not actually as powerful as he claims to be, that there are genuine constraints on what he can accomplish through executive action alone. So we're heading toward a major confrontation between the executive and judicial branches. Trump will keep claiming sweeping emergency authorities. Courts will keep saying those claims exceed statutory bounds, and at some point, we'll face the question of what happens when a president simply refuses to comply with judicial orders limiting his power. That's the constitutional crisis nobody wants to acknowledge might be coming. Make sure you're subscribed because this story is just beginning. We're going to see more rulings testing the limits of presidential emergency power, more confrontations between Trump and judges willing to check his authority, more questions about whether our constitutional system can survive a president determined to govern without meaningful restraint. Drop your thoughts in the comments about where you think this heads.